Well, hello everyone. This is a lecture that I want to provide to you in order to clarify these concepts that I find are difficult to understand unless somebody explains them to you. So I thought I would create this lecture. It is not based necessarily off the textbook, so that's something to keep in mind. However, I think that it will be useful in general to discuss the concepts of the elements and principles of design. So I hope you will enjoy this. And this is particularly oriented towards helping you with writing assignment number 3, which is the project in which you have to talk about a work of art that you create with an understanding of the concept of art in a very wide and open way. Okay? So, what are the elements of art and the principles of design? Now, your textbook calls them all elements and principles of design. Traditionally, they are subdivided into the elements of art and the principles of design. But they are to be understood as kind of all the same or all together rather, because they depend on each other, right? These concepts. But I just want to give you this visual aid, which I also put in the in announcement for Unit 2. And line, shape, color, value, form, texture, and space are the so-called elements of art. These are the building blocks of art. All right. It's a nice way to think about them in this way. The building blocks of art, the things with which you make art. And then the principles of design, which are balance, contrast, emphasis, movement, pattern, rhythm, and unity, are the way in which you combine in various ways to achieve different effects these building blocks, right? So again, the elements of art are the building blocks, and then the principles of design are the way in which you combine these building blocks to achieve different effects in your work of art. So I'm not going to read this is for you, but I will define them here a little bit because I just want to bring up the terms before I go into the images. We can think of line in two ways, as actual or implied. All right. And also the same thing goes for shape, right? Actual or implied. So what do these two terms mean? Actual means real, something that is a mark. All right. So you have a pencil, for example, you have a piece of paper, you make a line with your pencil, and that is an actual line. It is it has an existence of its own. It's a mark on the paper. You can also make lines, actual lines, with pointy tools. For example, when carving, you can make them in sculpture with more pointy tools. Etc., etc. Right? So the same thing with a shape. A shape is it's what you make with a line, and it can be closed or open. But a shape is also actual or implied. So we defined actual. It exists. It has. It's a mark. All right. That has been made. And then implied means that it is the result, for example, of a contrast of colors, right? So a contrast of colors, red and blue in the American flag, can make an implied shape, right? Or an implied line in some cases, in the cases of the stripes, for example. The other distinction that we think of when we think of line and shape is organic or geometric. So geometric is usually referring, when it comes to line, to straight lines, right? Straight lines of different kinds. The geometric shape does not have to be a regular shape or a known shape like a square or a rectangle. It can be irregular. But we often think of them as straight, more structured, and geometric in that sense. And then organic would be the opposite. Organic means like a living or perhaps dead, but an organism, right? Like an organism. So we usually think of lines that are organic as curvier but irregular, right? Curvier but irregular, perhaps a soft curve, right? Or wave. That would be understood as organic. And when it comes to shape, it's the same idea. A shape that is made with perhaps lines that are not geometric, and therefore they are more like a living organism. Color, we think of it as either saturated or neutralized. So color, when we say saturated color, we refer to a bright color, a color that is close to the original hue, all right? So a red that is truly red, like the colors that I've given to these letters here. These are saturated colors, right? Both the blue and the red are saturated. That means that they are closer to the pure hue, that they are intense. And neutralized are going to be colors more like brown or tan, or colors that are the result of the mix of many colors and that are dulled as a result, right? So we call that neutralized. Sometimes you can call it dulled, right? But they are not saturated, they are not closer to the pure hue. Then we can also think of color as primary colors, secondary colors, complementary colors, and analogous colors. And I will explain that when we look at an image that has color. So hold that thought for now. Value is the relative lightness or darkness of a color. So value refers in this particular case, when we're talking about color, to a lighter color or a darker color, right? So if we have a blue, we have a lighter blue, like this one, perhaps, right? That's a lighter value. And then we have it also darker, right? So again, that it has to do with the mix of white, right? And here we have again the same idea. Lighter green, darker green, lighter gray or whitish, right, or darker. And so that's very straightforward. Form refers to the impression of or the suggestion, visual suggestion of the three dimensions of an object on a two-dimensional artistic medium, right? So if we have a painting and there's a painted ball, for example, and it looks like a real ball thanks to the use of light and shadow or light and dark, then that ball is actually not a shape, it is a form, all right? So it has to do with the more convincing suggestion of the illusionism of the object on the paper. Then texture is distinguished as being real or implied. So again, the same thing as it means real means actual, but for whatever reason, the word real is more used when it comes to texture. So real is a texture that you can touch and that it feels like what it is, right? So in a real object, real texture can be smooth, it can be rough, it can be pointy, it can be various adjectives that you can use to describe texture, but usually smooth and rough are the most common ones. And implied, just like with line and with shape, means illusion, right? So instead of the texture being real in a painting, for example, a painted texture like the painting of a fur or the fur of a dog, for example, or a very soft cloth, or rough earth, or the roughness of a stone that are painted or photographed, those are they are said to be implied, right? Because again, it's the illusion of reality, but not reality. And finally, we have space, and that is distinguished as being deep or shallow. Deep space or spatial recession refers to the idea of the suggestion of the three dimensions of real space on a two-dimensional surface. And shallow space refers to the idea that whatever is in the image is closer to the foreground. All right, so deep or shallow. And by the way, I will be discussing examples, so don't panic. All right, I just want to introduce the terms first, so then when you review, you get some definitions. And if you can bear with me, we have a few more definitions here. The principles of design. This is going to be a little faster. The principles of design as we said, are balance, contrast, emphasis, movement, pattern, rhythm, and unity. So balance, we can make a distinction between symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. And what does that mean? Symmetrical balance means that the image is organized in a way where two sides, which can be the left and the right, or the top or the bottom, are not identical, but they create a balance that is largely arranged in a symmetrical way. All right, so we are going to look at very many examples of that. And then asymmetrical is the opposite, right? The balance of the painting or the photograph or the sculpture, anything that we make, is asymmetrically balanced. All right, so again, we are going to look at examples that are going to clarify that. Contrast. Contrast is easy because it's very intuitive. We can have contrast using the elements of art, right? So contrast of colors. Color is an element of art. Then we have contrast of colors, red and blue, as I said. They stand next to each other. They create a contrast, all right? Contrast of textures in works of art. Oftentimes you might have something that looks in an implied texture very smooth and next to something that looks rough, right? And so that's a contrast of textures. And then contrast of shapes, maybe shapes that are organic, one that is organic and one that is geometric, maybe, closer to each other. Emphasis refers, and this is kind of easy, emphasis is the area of the work of art that calls your attention first. All right, so the first place where your eyes go. And that is, again, a very strong aspect of composition. So you can see this in here, right? Very clearly the area that calls your attention first is this geometric shape that we have in here, and then these lines create deep space because they lead our eyes into the background. All right, so we're already analyzing in a more complex way. Then we have movement. Movement refers to the movement of our eyes through a work of art. Because again, we have an area of emphasis, the place where our eyes go first, right? But then also our eyes move in a certain way through the work. It's usually instantaneous. It's not that we first look at one thing and then we look at another thing and then we look at another thing, but there is nevertheless movement, right? We're going to be discussing that. Then we have pattern and rhythm. Pattern is like a mathematical pattern, right? The idea, like this image has in here, there are these little bows. It's very predictable, right? You have one bow, then you have another bow, then you have another bow. They are all the same size. They all are organized in creating a pattern. But again, it's regular and predictable. And then rhythm is similar, but it is less regular and less predictable. So we have these organic lines and shapes in here, and these organic lines and shapes are creating a rhythm because these shapes are organic. Precisely, they do not look so geometric, they do not look so regular, and they are not as predictable. All right. Okay, and finally, unity. Unity is what, in a way, it's difficult to describe, but it refers to the idea of how the artwork is held together, right? In other words, visually. I mean, how there are a number of things in the work of art that make the work of art be unified, have a certain sense of unity, and that is a concept that we're going to be discussing. So next thing that I want to do is discuss a number of works of art that are going to, we're going to use to exemplify all of these concepts together as in a more holistic way. By the way, this lecture has all these photographs that are photojournalism, right? So again, it's a lecture that I have prepared for other occasions, but I just want to tell you that these are all photographs. A lot of them, the first ones are all black and white because it's easier to focus on the elements and principles other than color when we do not discuss color in them. But then we're going to introduce color. But they are all photographs, and the idea is what's unifying this idea, all of these works, is that they are all examples of documentary photography or photojournalism. So what do we have in here? We have a photograph. It's called Dead Confederate Soldier with Gun by Matthew Brady. It is a Civil War photograph, right? Just to give you a little background. And what we have here is a very compelling photograph, right? One that I think a lot of people react to it in a very emotional way, even. However, there are some reasons why this work is so compelling, right? And that is what we need to investigate from a visual point of view. How do the elements of art and the principles of design, how are they organized? How are they working together in order to make this compelling image, this engaging? When I say compelling, I mean engaging, right? Something that we want to look at, something that holds our attention. So the first thing, as usual, is looking at emphasis, right? What calls our attention first? And I don't know what calls your attention first, but I think for most people, it is the shape of the dead soldier, right? And we could call this a form, right? Because as you can see, the photograph here has light and shadow. So we will immediately be able to tell that this is a human body. It is three-dimensional. We can relate to it, of course, because it has a face, and anything that looks like us in a way is going to make us relate more easily. So, but we have ultimately a form, right? A form that is an organic form because it's made with organic shapes, right? And what else, or how else does the photographer compel our attention? Well, it's an area of emphasis. It's kind of in the center, right? It's a human being, so again, we are likely to react to that. But it's in the center. And then in addition to that, it has been framed, right, with these objects, the tree trunk here and the gun, right? So there is a sense of the figure is in there right in the center, but at the same time, it has been given more attention by framing it in this sort of triangular implied shape. All right, so we have a form here, and then here we have an implied shape. And you might say, well, but it's not a drawn shape. Well, precisely, it's implied, right? So we have this gun and this tree trunk are closing approximately this shape, and they create, as we say, a shape that then allows us to more clearly focus on the form of the body. All right, so what else? So we have shapes. Now the shape, of course, is made with lines, right? So these are implied lines. They are implied lines because they are not drawn. They are not, the photographer did not actually go and make a mark. The photography works with light and shadow. So technically, everything is really implied, right? So we have, again, these implied lines that make this implied shape. Would you call this geometric or organic shape? Well, you could say, well, the tree trunk is organic, right? Because obviously it's a living organism. But here, because it creates a line, it really is more like a geometric line, right? I mean, yeah, it's not extremely regular, but at the same time, it is more geometric, and so is the gun, right? And so is the other gun and the stretcher, right? They are creating all these lines and shapes that are geometric. Okay, so how does this call attention and make a compelling work? Well, we have that shape, and then we have these other objects that create a rhythm, right? So there's one here, there's another here, there's another here, there's another here, and that is creating a rhythm, okay? And as a result, we have this idea of a kind of almost like a procession, let's say, of shapes and lines that create this rhythm that then goes back and brings attention to the central form of the dead soldier. So the composition, as we call it, or the design, if you will, is going to bring attention to the body back and forth. Part of that has to do with space, right? So the space, our eyes are led in this direction, all right? Our eyes are led in this direction. Because again, we see the head of the soldier, and then we see this one thing here. I'm sorry. We see this one thing here, then we see this here, then we see this here, then we see this here. And as a result, this is a deep space, right? We see this is created through this rhythm of shapes. Okay, then we have texture. So texture, there are many textures, right? We could say that this is shiny, right? And this is rough, and this is smooth, and this is rough, and everything else is rough, right? So the texture creates that. And again, there is a contrast of textures, right? So we have the contrast of this texture here, which is smooth and to the touch, smooth to the touch. And then the tree trunk is going to be rough, all right? Well, I think that's about it from what I can remember. Where in any analysis, you're not going to use all of the elements and all of the principles. They are not going to be that obvious, right? But some of them stand out, and then they come together. The other thing that I wanted to tell you is space. We already discussed that, and movement, right? So movement, emphasis brings our eyes here, and then space and movement are often connected because our eyes are going to move in the direction towards the background. All right? So that is one. Then, and I apologize for the theme of death, right? But it is, again, they are really good examples that will help us understand everything. So this is another Civil War photograph. It is by Alexander Gardner, Matthew Brady team. They were a team of photographers working in the Civil War. And this, of course, shows the battlefield after the battle, right? Antietam. And so this is it's an incredible photograph because it shows death in a very real way. Photography at this time was a relatively novel technique, and people were very, very shocked to see the bodies that had been fighting at a distance, right? To see them in such a compelling way. And again, this would cause great impressions on the people that would see these works. But again, if we're going to think about it from the point of view of organization, now you could say it's a photograph. The artist isn't doing anything in terms of creating, right? The bodies are there, they are dead, the field is there, there's nothing that the artist is actually creating. It's not a painting, it's not a sculpture, it's the reality in front of the camera. But of course, if you have ever taken photographs, which I'm sure you have, you know that you can alter the views, and even without doing any editing or any kind of Photoshop, let's say, you can alter the perception of reality through photography, right? In part because the camera lens is already designed to do that, right? So we're going to investigate how this is done here. We see all these bodies, so I think you can probably guess that by now these bodies would be understood as forms, right? Because they are three-dimensional, they have light and shadow, etc., right? So that part is easy. Then some things that we already know, texture, right? So this would be, it's all implied because photography, of course, is a trick of the eye, right? So it's all implied texture, but nevertheless, it's rough, right? And it's very close to us. And the most important thing to remember as a distinction from the other work here is the idea of space, right? Here we have that this fence leads our eyes into the background, right? And creates deep space. And so does this road, right? So these are creating deep space. And that is, again, a trick of the lens, because the lens will actually make the perspective converge towards the horizon line, this being the horizon line. But it's not that our eyes don't do that, they do, but the camera does it even more, right? So it creates that. And of course, it also emphasizes something here, which is that when we see a body here, when we see a body here, then we see a body here, then we see a body here, etc., all these organic shapes, and the space continues seemingly endlessly beyond the horizon line, then we're going to assume that there are more bodies beyond, right? Which is, of course, going to cause an emotional response. All the things that, make a work of art, they create a response on the part of the viewer, and as a result, the work is far more compelling, right? So in that sense, the idea of the space makes us imagine that there are more bodies beyond, and so it makes it all the more impressive. All right. We haven't yet talked about value. So value is the lightness or darkness of a color. We haven't, these are not colors, it's black and white, but nevertheless, we see light and shadow, right? And light and shadow everywhere, that's what allows us to perceive these bodies and everything really, but particularly the bodies, as forms, not as shapes. Shapes are flat. I don't think I told you that yet. Shapes are flat, forms appear to be three-dimensional, right? And so here they appear to be, and of course they are because they are bodies, but the photograph is an illusion. Okay, so that's that. Then we have this, again, we move on to photography in the early 20th century, and this is a photograph of child labor, right? The Louis Hine was a photographer who took it upon himself to document child labor in factories in the United States, and he then helped to pass laws against child labor. So he's rather important, and this is one of the instances in which works of art have an impact in policy change, right? And in this case, it's a photograph, with the understanding that a photograph is a construction of reality, right? So the photographer, Louis Hine in this case, is making some choices that are going to emphasize the conditions of the girl, the working conditions of the girl. But that doesn't mean that, of course, this is not true, right? So the idea is that it is true, but the truth has been emphasized with the point of view of the artist, but what is in front of the camera is nevertheless in front of the camera and was at some point. So that there's the element of truth and let's say exaggeration, you could say, of the truth, if nothing else. So this is a very interesting work. And again, this is this girl working in a cotton mill, and you can see all the bobbins here, right? And the machine, and we see the little girl, right? She's not so little, but nevertheless, it's a girl. And again, you have to remember that Louis Hine here is trying to communicate his empathy, right, with the little girl, his feeling for the little girl and her situation. He wants to tell us that she's suffering, she's being abused, etc., without her doing really much of anything, but just being there, right? She's working. So how does he do that? Well, through space again, right? So the girl is working in this corridor in between a wall and the machines, right? As you can see in there. And because, as I was telling you, of the trick of the lens, right, the machines seems to shrink towards the deep space, and so does the wall, right? So that is that trick of the camera that we call perspective. And the little girl is in the center. So she's kind of trapped in between these two borders, right? The borders being the wall where she cannot go anywhere. She cannot go anywhere, and then she's trapped in between that and the machine, right? So the idea is, again, where is she going to go? So and she looks, yeah, you could say, well, she looks sad. He's made other choices, right? We can't see her face, but in reality, it's the space that tells us that she is trapped in this situation, and that's not going to change. And perhaps this could be her supervisor. We do not know that. But I think, again, the fact that the artist is using this idea of space is very important. So again, the same thing here. This would be at the emphasis of the work, right? It's a form. This would be the emphasis, and this is the space that creates this sense of depth. Very quickly recedes, right? As we say, very quickly or very sharply, and as a result, we see that. Okay. Well, those are the most important aspects of this work. Oh, and movement, right? Movement of our eyes, taking our eyes towards the background. So associated with space as well. The next one is a photograph that you may be familiar with because it's very, very famous. And if you're not, it's totally fine. It is called My Grandmother. It is from the Great Depression period. And it is a very famous photograph that appeared in Life magazine. It was meant to, let's say, communicate to the general public the suffering of migrant workers in California. It was taken by a photographer called Dorothea Lange. And this is the main difference between this and the other works that we have seen is the space, right? So this, we would consider this a shallow space. We have been talking about the suggestion of spatial depth, but this is a shallow space in which the three figures are pushed towards the foreground, all right? So the foreground is what is closest to us, right? We see her, she appears to be really very close to us, whereas the little girl before, she is in the middle ground there. And this lady here is in the background, right? Middle ground, background, and then foreground, right? She's pushed to the foreground. And things that are pushed to the foreground often make an impression on us because they appear to be very, very close, all right? So again, first thing that we want to look at in any work of art is the area of emphasis. I think it's very obvious that it's going to be her face, simply because she's, again, a human being. She's very close to us. She's in the center, right? So all of us, all of that is going to help us distinguish her more than anything else. And of course, it's a compelling photograph for a number of reasons. You could simply say, well, her face, right? Yeah, she has this her brow shows her worry because, again, she'll probably have nothing to eat. She has 3 children, as we can see, and she probably is having a really hard time anticipating what's going to happen to them. She's out of work. You know, there's this whole context that I think we can understand even without me telling you anything because the photograph is so compelling. But the composition is extremely important in making this photograph engaging to the viewer, right? So we have her face, again, which tells us about her worry, all that. And we have her 2 children on the sides. And this is where we're going to talk about balance a little bit. This is a very interesting photograph. And I told you that balance can be symmetrical or asymmetrical. And balance here is both, actually, right? In my opinion, at least. So how is that? We can say that it's symmetrical because the 2 kids are flanking her, right? They are on her on the 2 sides, right? And so she's in the middle, and that creates a balance all around her. So if we were to cut like the photograph in 2, more or less, her nose is going to be the dividing point, right? Now, one clarification. When I say symmetrical balance, I don't mean that the 2 sides need to be identical, right? That's another concept which is called bilateral symmetry, but we don't need to worry. It gives us the impression of symmetry, right? It gives us this nice, pleasurable visual effect of symmetry. Symmetry is very pleasing to the eyes. If you use it too much, in exaggeration, too regularly, it's boring. Okay, but nevertheless, in a photograph such as this one, where it's used in a balanced way, right? We have the heads of the 2 children and then the bodies of the 2 children. It really creates this visually pleasing effect, right? So against this face, that is the face of worry, we have these 2 children on the sides creating this pleasing effect. But then, why would this be asymmetrical? Well, because there are other things that kind of break the symmetry, which is a good thing, because remember that I told you that symmetry or symmetrical balance, maybe if it's too exaggerated, it may be boring, right? So here we have this baby, right, which we discover towards the end of the movement of our eyes, and we'll talk about that later. But the baby is here, and then we have the arm that kind of contradicts that, right? So these 2 implied lines that we have in here, implied directions, they are breaking the symmetrical balance here, and they create essentially an asymmetry, right? It's still balanced. It's still very balanced. And again, whether you feel it to be more symmetrical or you think it's more asymmetrical, honestly, it's a matter of personal perception. But nevertheless, it's extremely balanced, and in a good way, because again, we have that symmetry, and then that's broken by that, right? So we have value, of course. Here in a photograph where we get close, we can see the values of the face. The cheeks reflect the light a little bit more, and then we have more shadow in here, so that's value, lighter and darker. The faces, especially the faces of the children, they look, because of their haircuts, they look really three-dimensional. They are very much forms, right? And so is her elbow, which reflects, which we have light and shadow, and so those are forms, okay? Well, that's about it, okay? So in regards to composition, but again, it's a very visually compelling, and it touches our emotions because of the face, but also because of the very, very visually pleasing composition. When a composition is visually pleasing, when a design is visually pleasing, our eyes want to linger. We want to look further, right? If it's not interesting, or if it doesn't call our attention, we will just move on very quickly. But something like this is going to hold our attention, and that's the great success of a work of art. Dorothea Lange also did a lot of other photographs. This is, again, similar case as with the ones in which we talked about space. This is called Homeless Family, right? So we see a family that is going towards somewhere, right? We have this road that leads somewhere, and they are walking, and their shapes, their forms here, the forms of the bodies, they lead our eyes towards the horizon, right? And they also become smaller, right? So that's the effect also of space. They become, apparently, the shape of the man here, and probably the young boy or younger son, are seemingly smaller, and with the intention of showing that they are further away. All right. Okay, now we are now going into the 1930s, so a little bit later than the Great Depression, and this is in Spain, and I do not want to tell you the whole story because we're never going to finish, but this is a very interesting photograph, and it's called Falling Soldier. But one interesting detail about it is that it was supposedly the first photograph that showed the person in the process of dying, right? So falling in this particular case. So that's why it was said to be a very, very famous photograph. But the most striking element or aspect of this photograph is the balance. Now, I'm going to ask you, and you can think about this. You cannot answer, but you can think about it. Is this a symmetrical balance or an asymmetrical balance? Well, I get you got the correct answer. It's asymmetrical, right? So we have this whole area of empty space, right, or empty area in the work, and then this field area. And we can very, very easily create this sense of asymmetry. Now, it's still balanced, right? Well, you would say, well, if it's so asymmetrical, how is it balanced? It seems to me that this is an unbalanced work of art. Well, in my opinion, it isn't, right? And there are a number of things that make it be balanced in spite of the extreme asymmetry. And it has to do with these shadows here, right? So if you look at this area, there appears to be a shadowy area in the photograph, right? And that creates a kind of a rhythm with the shadow of the man, right? Okay, so that allows us it balances it, right? So essentially, we have this very, very heavy visual weight in here with all these dark values. I think it's a camera or some kind of weapon maybe that he's using. It's actually a camera because he was a photographer. And then some other like a purse that he's wearing. All of these things are values that are going to add visual weight, all right? And then there's the shadow, and then there's the gun that he's holding, all right? But then we have this large shadow in here, which takes up, if you think about the square inches perhaps of this shadow, and then you think about the square inches occupied by these three very dark shapes, it's probably about the same, right? And so the idea is that this is going to balance all of that. If this weren't here, then we would really, really, truly see an unbalanced photograph. But because it is, then that creates a balance. At the same time, there is an extreme asymmetry, right? So it's an asymmetrical balance. Well, that's it with this one. Okay. Now, D-Day. D-Day 1944, the invasion of Normandy. This is a very not sharp, all right? Out of focus photograph, and there's a story about it, which is that all the photographs that were taken on this day, they suffered an accident in the lab, and except 11 of them, right? And this is one of the lucky 11 photographs that survived, but it was still damaged. On the other hand, this hazy look that it has sort of helps us see this sense of urgency, I think, in the invasion, right? We see all these soldiers. So again, we see all these forms. They are three-dimensional, even though I have to tell you that because they are so dark, the photograph, as we said, it suffered some accidents, right? So it's not very sharp as a result. Because of that, the values of the bodies, right, the lightness and darkness, are just not as sharp. They do not offer that much distinction. We do not have enough of a contrast between light and dark. And so even though we do distinguish the volumes, right, they still are very much more like shapes, like flatter shapes, right? So we do need to know that these are soldiers. We do need to know that the work they are doing, in other words, in order to understand what's going on. But especially the ones that are further away, we would understand this as a shape, not so much as a form, because they do not have enough detail of light and shadow, okay? What is interesting here is that they are creating this space, right, with a widening line. These are implied lines. Now, when I say implied lines here, I mean that the shapes that we have are creating connections, and they lead our eyes through through movement. They create movement for our eyes, right? So from this shape in here, our eyes move to this one, our eyes move to that one, then our eyes move to that one, and they create a sense of movement, right, in the connection. It's not, it's an implied line, and the movement, of course, is suggested, but nevertheless, it's there, all right? We have a sense of distance as well, right? Especially because the values are lighter towards the background. And then if we think about texture here of the waves, we think, we know it's water, but we know it's also not that smooth, right? Because it has perhaps the foam, and so we might call this, a rougher texture, right? So those are some of the things that we have in this image. Okay. Cartier-Bresson is a photographer who was a documentary photographer and a photojournalist, and so he took a number of photographs that are really just for fun in this time period, and he had a very interesting compositional method. All right, so here, what do we have? We have movement. All right, how is the movement created? The movement is created by the pattern created by the staircase, right? So we see this pattern, and the pattern seems to lead our eyes in this kind of spiral shape, right? So we have that. Then, of course, we have lines, right? And we have, again, a lot of pattern here, and these are geometric lines, right? So pattern, geometric line, all right, all of that in there. And then we have this curve line, which is also geometric in this particular case, okay? And essentially all sorts of patterns, right? He's using this composition to engage us in a way, but it's a pattern. And then, of course, if we were to talk about balance, what would you say? Is this work balanced? Of course it is. Is it symmetrically balanced or is it asymmetrically balanced? I'll leave that question to you, but I will answer it right now. It is asymmetrically balanced because we have very different kinds of visual weights in here, right? This creates a relatively heavy visual weight, right? Because it's kind of, this pattern is fairly consistent. And then we have this visual weight of the bicycle rider, because this is a dark value, right? It makes a heavy weight. It's a smaller shape. It takes up less space than the staircase, but because it's darker, it balances asymmetrically. Okay, so I hope this is clear. It is complicated, but it's a fascinating composition, and it creates again pattern and sense of rhythm. It has a lot of contrast, and it has asymmetrical balance, which is created kind of diagonally in this case. Okay, so again, heavier visual weight. It's lighter, but it's busier because of this pattern, right? So heavier visual weight, but then less, also a heavy visual weight, because this is just a dark value. It creates a silhouette essentially, and as a result, it creates an asymmetrical balance. Okay, we get to color finally. You might be wondering where that was. Okay, this is a more contemporary or more recent rather photojournalism. It's a very, very famous photograph that appeared in the cover of National Geographic in 1984, and again it tells us about a girl which is called the Afghan girl, right? First thing that calls our attention, needless to say, are her eyes. They are so engaging. We have to look at her, right? And she has a mix of emotions in those eyes that are also very, very interesting. In my opinion, again, she looks defiant and aggressive, but also scared, right? Like a scared animal almost that is defensive, all right? And it has to do with her situation as a refugee. And you can read more about this online if you want to. At any rate, there are a number of things in here. So we begin to talk about color. Color, I told you that color can be saturated or neutralized, right? And in here we have both sets. So saturated colors are colors that are bright and are closer to the pure color. If you think about the color orange, I think this is a fairly intense saturated color, right? So orange is the color here, red orange, however you perceive it, and the green, right? The green is also extremely saturated, and they are working together in this very nice way. But then, that's my dog. But then, the other thing is her face. Now, human faces can be various colors depending on the race of the person, but I think they are a range of browns, right? We can go from a very light Caucasian white, as we might call the race, and then we can go all the way to black. But nevertheless, they are all neutralized, right? And so her skin color is always going to be neutralized. The color of her lips is neutralized and relatively light value. The color of her hair is a dark brown. Those are all neutralized colors because if you were to mix these colors, they result from the mix of many colors, right? And the more you mix a color, the least pure you make it. And as a result, then you're going to have a neutralized color. All right. And of course, the white of her eyes is obviously a very light value, right? Which also creates an idea. Now, the other concepts for colors we need to explain with a visual aid: complementary colors and analogous colors, right? But before we talk about that, let's talk about the primary and secondary. In the color wheel, which is a diagram, essentially we have primary colors and secondary colors. The primary colors are red, blue, and yellow, right? Now, there are very many shades of red, there are very many shades of blue, there are very many shades of yellow, but again, a basic concept of red, yellow, and blue that you can think of, those are the primary colors, all right? And those are the colors, when you mix these colors, they are the colors that you can use to make pretty much all the other colors, right? So in painting, at least. Then we have the secondary colors, which are the result of the mix of two primaries, right? So if you were to mix red and yellow, you get orange. If you were to mix red and blue, you get violet, even though it's very difficult to make. You have to mix it with a little white, otherwise it will be like a very dark purple. And then finally, if you were to mix yellow and blue, you get green, right? So the secondary colors are the result of a mix of the three mixes, or the possible mixes of the primaries, okay? So that's fairly easy. But so we could say that, again, this is a secondary color, right? The green. And then this is a red-orange, so it's still, in my opinion, more of an orange. Therefore, it's also a secondary color. But they are closer, especially the orange, is closer to the primary red, right? So if you think about it, it's an orange that is has been it's an intense orange, right? It's closer to the red. At any rate, there are complementary colors. Complementary colors, not complementary, complementary, right? Complementary. Complementary means that they are colors that are opposed from each other in the color wheel. Okay, the color wheel is a diagram that was created by who knows who. And it is used, it's a very convenient diagram, right? And these colors are usually placed opposed to each other. And if you think about it, the red and the green here are opposed to each other. The yellow and the violet are opposed to each other. The blue and the orange are opposed to each other in the color wheel. Those are the complementary colors. And indeed, this red violet, or magenta as you might call it, or this yellow green as you might call it, then they're also opposed to each other. They are also complementary. And what does this mean? It means that when you put them close to each other, especially in similar proportions, they reinforce each other. They are already saturated, right? They are already bright and pure. Well, because they are next to each other or close to each other, they reinforce this saturation. So if you look at this green in here, it looks really, really intense, right? And it is, but it is all the more intense because it is next to the orange, right? And so these are not exact complementaries, the orange, red, and the green, but they are close enough, right? And so they reinforce each other. They make this image all the more compelling. If she were wearing, I don't know, gray and yellow, this photograph would not be as compelling. That has to do in part with the fact that her eyes are green, right? So the photographer he took the photograph. The girl was dressed in this way. He might have altered the colors a little bit. We don't know that. But nevertheless, the idea is that we start with her eyes, which is something that you cannot change, right? And then the rest enhances the eyes, right? The fact that her eyes look so green in here probably has to do with the fact that this background green reinforces the color of her eyes. Okay, then analogous colors are colors that are next to each other in the color wheel, so they look good together, right? Because so if you are going to get dressed, for example, with you in the morning, you wear jeans, for example, which we all do. Well, the jeans look good with just about everything, in part because it's a neutralized blue, right? But also, if you match them with, let's say, green or another blue, right, or even a purple, they will look even better because those are colors that are closer to each other in the color wheel. All right, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so done with that. Now we have another photograph by the same photojournalist, Steve McCurry. This is a more recent one, and it's a digital photograph. And it is called Geisha in Subway, right? And we have here in the photograph the color, right? And color is used, and we're going to discuss the concept of unity now, it's used to unify the composition. So this composition, as we call it, a composition or a design, it's the same thing. This composition is complex, right? It has a lot of things. It's a geisha dressed in this very sophisticated manner. She's in the subway. The subway, again, is not the place for a geisha, you would think. But nevertheless, that's precisely the point. She is in a tradition and modernity, right? All in one place. But from the compositional point of view, this is a very complex work. So if we look at the geisha, she's clearly the emphasis of the photograph, right? She's clearly the emphasis. It's what calls our attention first because she's in the center. She creates essentially a division in the space. So there's a sense of symmetry with these two things around her, right? They're very different, but nevertheless, she really leads our eyes in that direction. Then we have space, right? Because our eyes are led thanks to these implied lines, right? So deep space led by these implied lines and by the staircase, right? Which creates a pattern made with regular lines and shapes that are geometric, right? And they go creating this pattern and leading our eyes. So there's movement, there's pattern, of course, in the tiles in here, and that flattens the representation. But certainly what calls our attention are the colors here, right? The colors. And if we look at the colors, there's like an yellow-green, there's the red, right? So again, not exact complementaries, but very saturated colors that call our attention. Then we have her very white face, because she is wearing this white makeup, and her very extremely pitch black hair, right? So also contrast of values, extreme, really, extreme contrast of values, okay? Okay, so the question is, we have this very, very colorful area and this whole area that is completely different, right? It's black and white. It is, it has a pattern that is very different from what she's wearing, which is more like an organic, if you think about it. It's completely different. So this would normally be not unified. There would be the threat of lack of unity in the work of art. But there are some things in here that unify the work, and it has to do with color, right? So look at this yellow stepping area there and this yellow sign. It is kind of the same yellow of her sash here, right? So we have this, and that. And it appears in three places. They are not, it's not that the colors are blended in any way with anything else, but the fact that they appear in these three places, that creates unity, because our eyes go to the geisha first, but then they can also move towards the two other sides, okay? And then, of course, we have the hair, it's very black, and we have very lots of black in here all throughout, right? So not in any one place that leads our eyes, but nevertheless in very, very many places. And then her face is extremely white, and we have these very, very bright lights throughout, right? So that is how unity occurs. Again, this is a type of composition that, because there's so much contrast of color and value and of everything, it might appear to be not unified. But these little things are going to help our eyes to find various places in which they find repeated colors in this particular case, and they are going to make a unified composition. Okay? All right. Finally, we have we have two more, right? So this is again another photographer, and his name is not here. I should have put it. It's Josh Kersey, and he took this photograph in Malaysia, and it shows obviously women sewing and making clothing, right? And it's a very interesting composition because it distorts the space. Now, again, the camera tends to distort space a lot, and especially if you get close to one thing and angle the camera in a particular way, it will make something look really big, and then it will make some other things shrink very quickly, right? And that's what's happening in here. So we have this woman making clothes, right? And we have this sewing machine here that is extremely large, right? So with that contrast between the very, very large sewing machine and the shrinking space leading our eyes towards the background, that will create a sense of space, okay? That change. Then we have neutralized and saturated colors and complementary colors and analogous colors. So by now you should be able to figure that out, but I'll tell you in case you're not. Neutralized are going to be all the browns, right? And all the skin color. Those are all neutralized because they are brown, right? Also the mattes here, all of that. And then in contrast to that, we have these extremely saturated colors, right? Super bright green, 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 red, blue, and green blue. Okay. And so these two, we could say they call our attention, right? They compete visually with this gigantic thing, which is the sewing machine. They compete visually because they are complementary colors, because they reinforce each other, right? This red and this green. And then at the same time, in order to create a sense of connection, so this is fairly unified, we have this light blue green and this saturated blue that are going to work in this case as analogous colors, right? They are closer to each other in the color wheel. Okay, so those are some of the things that we see. Okay, and finally, this is a relatively recent photograph made by a documentary photographer called Ben Lowry in New York, and it's documenting Hurricane Sandy in I can't remember what year this was, but at any rate, it's in the 2000s, right? And it's a very interesting photograph because, in my opinion, it tells us, it has perhaps a meaning if we want to read into it, which has to do with the presence of God in situations that are stressful or not happy, right? Such as a flood or a hurricane. There's a book very much in the foreground, right? And we do not know if this book is the Bible, but we would assume that it is because it looks like it has these really thin pages. And then there's a house. And the interesting thing is that, again, this might be casual, right? It doesn't, the photographer went around with his camera taking pictures, all right? That's all he did. But because he put two things close to each other, which in this case are the book and the house, then there is a visual connection among these two objects. And as a result, we are going to interpret some meaning into it, right? Because that's what images make us do. The things that are close to each other, when they have a connection, they make us interpret meaning, right? Almost invent meaning, if you will. But nevertheless, they do that. Well, so there's this book. The book has a certain shape, right? And it has these lines, right? Implied lines, because it's a book and it's a photograph, in here creating this angle. And how is it connected to the house? Well, partially through the color, right? Because both of them are neutralized. Then also through the angles, right? I'm trying to move my mouse here. Okay, think about that. So we have these repeated shapes, right? Here and here. So essentially, we are creating a rhythm, right? We're creating a rhythm through these shapes, and we're creating this connection of neutralized colors because the colors of the house and the color of the book are similar, and because they are linked with each other visually, creating an implied line, then we get this sense of their connection. And we might think that perhaps this book came out of the house, right? It just moved with the water. We do not know, right? Somehow it landed here on the street. And it might mean a good number of things. It might mean that the house is protected by this book that we assume to be the Bible, or perhaps that it was abandoned by God. Whatever you want to read, right? Or whatever you want to interpret out of it. At any rate, there's that visual connection. There's also the foreground, and the house is not so much in the full background, but towards the background. Right? The background will be the trees, but it's towards the background. Okay, so we have that. Then we have the rest of the composition, right? Because again, these two things, especially the book, are going to call our attention very, very quickly. But there are other things that our eyes are going to soon find. First, there's the water. What would you say is the texture here? I think the first thing that calls our attention in relation to the water is the idea of texture, right? It feels smooth and glossy, shiny. Most likely it's been retouched, all right, meaning it's been photoshopped. But nevertheless, it has this thickness and reflection to it that bring the element of texture very much to the foreground. And also value, right? Lighter and darker brown that are going to create this impression of the ripples on the water. Okay. And then there's a blue here, like a bluish color with this house, right? Bluish greenish, you could say. And then there's something else that is a complementary color to the blue that balances the composition, you could say. And it is this very lively traffic cone. The traffic cone really stands out as a color-wise, right? It's away from our eyesight. It's not really the thing that calls our attention first, but it balances the composition, right? And there's also this kind of bluish um, trash can, right? So they help each other. They create a sense of balance by standing away from each other, but more or less connected. And then this thing in here also kind of balances out with this house a little bit the composition. So this is actually mostly a symmetrical balance. Okay. Well, and of course, this unifies it, right? So again, the similar colors unify the composition. Okay, well, that is my lecture. And what I wanted to do was to show you these elements and principles of design, or elements of art and principles of design, in a way that is more holistic, in a way where you look at an image and you don't just have a list of terms, but rather you can combine them and think of them as a whole. So in your analysis of art and in your own project, this is what I'd like to do. I'd like for you to think of these elements of art and principles of design as in tandem, right? Connected with each other, reinforcing each other, the building blocks, and how you combine them. It's been lovely talking to you, and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.